idea that China is going to end up like a Western-style society is a nonsense. China will remain China. Well, there's been a very long-held belief in the West that really modernity comes in one form only. It is singular and not plural. The only way of being modern is the Western way. In other words, Western modernity is the only show in town. Now, it's a bit as if you think of the world on an escalator and the various countries are spread out, the less developed ones at the bottom of the escalator, the Western ones at the top, and we're all heading for the same destination. And that destination is Western-style modernity. Now, it's true that there is some historical basis for this, because from the late 18th century right the way through the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, every country that industrialized in that period, with one exception, Japan, was a Western country. So, in fact, in that period, modernization was almost synonymous with being Western. But that situation has changed. I mean, over the period since the Second World War, from the late 50s, early 60s, you got the rise of the Asian tigers. And then right the way across East Asia, of course, especially China, engaging in its process of modernization, and that's now spread to South Asia, and it's spreading around the world. So modernity is no longer a monopoly of the West. Modernity has become something which is rapidly being shared around the world. So what kind of modernity are these countries developing? Because they don't come from the same background as the West. Now, I think a lot of Westerners probably think like this. Essentially, modernity is a product of competition, markets, and technology. And so we're all the same, ultimately. You know, you just got to look at the high-rise buildings and the infrastructure, and there's a recognizable similarity around the world. But actually, this is not to look at, as it were, the soft side of modernity. The soft side of modernity is something entirely different. And this is a product of history and culture. Each country has its own distinctive history and culture. And the consequence of this is that each country's modernity is very distinctive from another country. For example, Europe became divided into lots of nation states, which were basically organized around, for the most part, a single race or a single ethnicity. And European countries were relatively small. I mean, most European countries, well, they vary between a few million to, today, 80 million, something like that. So there were very distinctive conditions which operated: religion, Christianity, and so on. All of these things shaped the nature of modernity. Now, actually, I mentioned Japan earlier on, and if we'd only studied Japan properly, we would understand the fact is that Japan's modernity is very different from Western modernity, because for over a century it's remained remarkably distinctive in all sorts of ways. In its culture, its behaviour, even in its governance, it's very distinctive from the Western countries. But now we're in a situation where modernity is travelling around the world, and lots of countries in different continents are now rising up. And what is going to happen is, and what we can see is already happening, is that modernity is not singular, but modernity is plural. There are multiple modernities. And of course, China is a classic example. I mean, the idea that China is going to end up like a Western-style society is a nonsense. China will, in lots and lots of different ways, remain highly distinctive in terms of its social relations, in terms of its societal norms, in terms of its attitude and behaviour on the global stage. China will remain China.